Good. So hi everyone, and welcome to this little talk on the situation of human rights in Palestine that we have organized with Michael. And I'm from Sodepaz. We are recording this, and it's going to be live in Facebook as well. But after that, we are going to edit the conference, and it's going to be available in the UPV page. And thank you to the UPV as well to helping us organize this little chat. Sodepaz is a little NGO that is based in Spain, and we've been working in Palestine like basically since we started 30 years ago. And we historically worked in the field of human rights in Palestine, cooperating with Addameer, for example, and other human rights organizations there. But we also do some work here in Spain to awareness and to raise conscience about the situation in Palestine. Regarding this conference is part of a little project which has been founded by Bilbao City Council. And thanks to the UPV as well, to the University in the Basque Country, we're being able to do this. I want to remind you that we have the chat here for if you want to make some question, you can do it during the conference, and then at the end we have like 15-20 minutes according to the time to collect all the question and pass it to Michael. So after that, I just pass the word to Jose Ramon. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Hello, everybody. Good morning to the Americans and good afternoon to Europeans and Asians. So it's a real pleasure to be able to co-host this workshop seminar with Sodepaz and to have Michael Link speaking to us. It's an honor actually to have such a personality who's representing the UN rapporteur post on such an important and delicate topic of concern to all human rights scholars and activists and all citizens who are concerned about human rights and international relations. Michael Link is going to speak to us from London, Ontario, not London, UK, but London, Ontario. So I guess it's early in the morning for you there. In Canada. Not only is Michael a UN rapporteur for the occupied Palestinian territories, he's also a scholar who has written prominently and profusely about the Palestinian occupied territories and the human rights situations. His main specialty, if I'm not mistaken, is labor law and labor relations as a scholar. And of course, this is an issue which is very much in question in the human rights situation in the occupied territories in Palestine, because labor issues and labor relations are a key element for the way of life and for the quality of life of Palestinians. So we at EH is a program of the rector of the University of the Basque Country that is intended to bring together civil society institutions and the academia, the academy. And the purpose of this program is to discuss issues of current interest. And of course, we have been dealing with international issues, the situation of human rights internationally. And this, of course, is one of such salient issues that is probably at the center of much of the international relations throughout the world, not only the Middle East, but it transcends the Middle East issues. If you zoom out from the territory, it probably concerns really the whole world. But if you zoom in, you start seeing many of the difficult issues and challenges, especially concerning human rights. And it is right that since at least 30 years, the United Nations has been concerned about updating on the human rights situation in the Palestinian territories, and the Human Rights Council of the UN has had this very high on its agenda. And since 2016, Michael Lynk has been the rapporteur of the UN for the occupied Palestinian territories to report on the situation of human rights, an issue that he has also been working on as an academic. So it is, he's probably the most fitting person to speak to us about this, and we are very keen to listen and learn from you, Michael. So the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much for that warm introduction, and thank you for the organizers of today's seminar or panel. I'm grateful to be asked to do this. It's always a warm invitation coming from Spain. This is the second time I've spoken to Spanish audiences in the last several months. To your question. As was said in the introduction, I am the special rapporteur appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council in 2016. My work is volunteer, it's unpaid. I keep my day job as a law professor here in Canada. I issue 2 reports a year, one to the Human Rights Council in Geneva and a second to the General Assembly in New York. And as well, I issue a number of statements when issues of human rights concerns wind up arising. And what I want to do today is 2 things. First, I just want to take you through a brief run-through of the principal human rights trends and violations and concerns that I have commented on over the last year. And then secondly, I want to take you through a PowerPoint that lays out some of the international law issues governing the occupation of Palestine and the refusal by Israel, or the defiance of Israel, with respect to not putting itself in compliance with international law and the direction of the international community. So first, just to turn to some of the issues with respect to human rights in the occupied territory over the last year. One of the first things I commented on at the very beginning of January 2020 was the decision taken about 2 weeks before then, just before Christmas in 2019, by the special prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to want to proceed to advance her review of alleged war crimes in the situation of Palestine to the second stage, to the investigation stage. And I had commented upon that. I welcomed the decision of the special prosecutor to be able to do that, because this is one of the very few issues of accountability which actually has the power of putting teeth into the situation. One of the striking aspects of the Israel-Palestine conflict is that there is a huge amount of international law, some of which I'll take you through a little bit later on the conflict. And yet there is so little accountability, either by Israel or by the international community, requiring Israel to be obedient to international law and international direction. The next thing that I paid attention to was obviously the rise of COVID-19 and its impact upon the Palestinians in the occupied territory. And I've made several comments with respect to this, and I'm probably going to be making another one within the next few weeks because of the serious rise in cases in both the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and in the Gaza Strip. I reminded, in my various statements on this, I've reminded Israel that it is the occupying power in East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza, and that therefore it owes, it has the obligation under the 4th Geneva Convention as the occupying power to ensure that all necessary preventative means are being taken in order to combat the spread of COVID-19. And this kind of cooperation has gone on, has not gone on in the spirit and direction of international humanitarian law. And this is why I continue to point to the fact that, that Israel is not in compliance with its obligations. In June of 2020, I commented on the looming annexation the de jure annexation by planned by Israel with the support of the Trump administration in the United States. And in doing so, I joined 66 other UN human rights experts with respect to pointing out to what a serious breach of international law, and particularly international human rights and humanitarian law, such annexation would wind up being. And just to give you an indication of the kinds of human rights violations that occur there, I listed them and pointed out that the violations include land confiscation, settler violence, discriminatory planning laws, the confiscation of Palestinian natural resources, home demolitions, forcible population transfer, the excessive use of force and torture, labor exploitation, the extensive infringement of privacy rights, the targeting of female women activists and journalists, the detention of children, forced evictions and displacement, economic deprivation and extreme poverty, and food insecurity, among many other aspects. What I and other human rights experts warned about in that statement in mid-June with respect to the looming annexation at that time was the fact that that we're now looking down the abyss of apartheid. Already what we have in Israel and Palestine is two peoples living in the same space, ruled by the same state, but with profoundly unequal rights. And what I and the other 66 human rights experts said was that this is a vision of a 21st century apartheid, something worrisome with respect to our modern sense of equality and the primacy of human rights. Later on the summer, I had issued my most recent report to the UN Human Rights Council, where I warned the Council and the world with respect to the issue of collective punishment. Collective punishment is forbidden by all modern legal systems that respect the rule of law, and it's forbidden by international humanitarian law by Article 33 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. And I paid attention to two issues with respect to this. One was the ongoing 13-year-old closure of Gaza, which, because of the tight air, sea, and land blockade that Israel had imposed upon this, it now suffers from a completely collapsed economy, a devastated infrastructure, and a barely functioning social service system. I also pointed out that Israel enforces collective punishment through the demolition of Palestinian homes. There have been over 2,000 homes owned by Palestinians demolished by Israel since 1967, since the start of the occupation, where a member of that family had allegedly committed a security offense and was caught and imprisoned or was killed. And what Israel does then is punish the family of that alleged perpetrator. Could be a son, it could be a husband, it could be a father. And what they wind up doing is destroying the home of that family. Collective punishment is forbidden in any modern legal system that follows the rule of law and obeys human rights, because it is punishment without crime. You're punishing innocent people. And a cornerstone of any legal system is that only the guilty are punished and the innocent are left free of the impositions of the law. I then, in late October, and I'll come to this in a few minutes, I called upon the world to endorse a new culture of accountability with respect to Israel. I pointed out that the Security Council of the United Nations had passed over 30 resolutions over the last 50 years with respect to the definition of occupation and the Fourth Geneva Convention, with respect to settlements, with respect to annexation. Israel has obeyed none of them, and this gap between international law and international accountability, between promise and performance, winds up creating a big gap in international law. It reduces the public respect for international law if laws are proclaimed but laws are not enforced. I also pointed out in my most recent report in October on accountability that the influential role of businesses and corporations in sustaining and allowing to grow the Israeli settlement economy. And I'll point to settlements in a few minutes when I show you some of my PowerPoint slides. Most recently, I have issued a statement pointing to the high number of settlement housing unit approvals by Israel. 2020 has marked a record over the last decade with respect to the number of housing units that Israel has approved with respect to its 250 illegal settlements in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. Israel is continuing to devour the land that the world had said is meant for a Palestinian state. The world will sometimes object to this, but the world will not act. And at the end of October, there have been an announcement of another 5,000 housing units, bringing to date something in the range of between 12 and 13,000 housing units that have been approved for this year. And at the same time, as Israel is massively expanding its settlement presence in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, it is continuing with its demolition of Palestinian homes. And most recently, there was a Palestinian Bedouin village in the northern Jordan Valley that Israel demolished in early November, wiping out the homes for 74 Palestinian people who were on their traditional grazing lands, but this land had been declared to be a closed military firing zone by Israel, and therefore giving it the authority to be able to remove Palestinians from those territories. So all of the human rights directions, I'm afraid, are going, all the human rights trends in the occupied territory are going in the wrong direction. The occupying power is deepening its presence in these territories. It is preparing for a future de jure annexation claim and leaving the Palestinians with what the world would probably generously call a Bantustan or a statelet, where they are confined to a minimum amount of territory on their own homeland, unable to be able to move freely from one area to another, unable to trade their goods freely from one area to another. So what I want to do now is just share with you a few slides. I'm assuming now you can see my slide. I want to point out to you, first of all, the importance of why we should be talking, particularly students studying law like you are, should be talking about the principles of international human rights law and international humanitarian law to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I've given you several reasons there. The most important ones is that, first of all, the international community has a particular responsibility towards a just and durable resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, particularly with respect to the primary victims of this, which are the Palestinian people. This is not only the most malignant and enduring of international conflicts, but is the most international of conflicts. It was the United Nations that voted to partition Palestine in 1947. It's the United Nations that has been looking after Palestinian refugees since 1949, which now number over 5 million refugees in various parts of the world, most of them concentrated in the Middle East. There is a rich body of international law that the United Nations, through the General Assembly, the Security Council, and the Human Rights Council, has proclaimed apply to this. And if international law was actually applied to the conflict, I think what we would have is probably the basis for a just and lasting, durable solution, because they support the right of Palestinians to a self-determination. They support the Palestinian claim that the settlements are illegal, that annexation is illegal, and that this is an occupation and they are a protected people, which I'll take you through. So I'm going to briefly try to take you through 4 key international law issues today on occupation, annexation, the Israeli settlements, and if I can find time, on accountability as well. And this is a map of Israel and the Palestinian territory. You can see in the middle of the map to your left the Gaza Strip, which is home to 2 million Palestinians, And the Gaza Strip, as I had mentioned a few minutes ago, has been under siege or under a blockade since 2007. This is the West Bank here. The area in blue is the area under full Israeli security and military law. This is where the 250 Israeli settlements are. What the Palestinians have is the area in orange in the West Bank and East that they rule, which is approximately 40% of the West Bank. But they rule very equivalent to a municipality or a city. They have no border with any external country in the West Bank. Any movement that they make from one part of the West Bank to another has to be with Israeli permission. It has to go through Israeli checkpoints and blockades. And it means that in order to be able to travel internationally or to trade your goods internationally, in order to have a functioning economy, you have to have the absolute permission of Israel to be able to do so. So with respect to occupation, what I want to be able to point out is that the international community has considered the Palestinian territory to be occupied since the June 1967 war. The occupation, as you can see here, is governed by the Fourth Geneva Convention of 1949. The four Geneva Conventions are among the most ratified international agreements in the world. They're the countries that belong to them, which is about 186 countries in the world, including Israel, are called the high contracting parties. And what the Fourth Geneva Convention determines is that the Palestinians are a protected people, that occupation is supposed to be temporary. Occupations are not supposed to last in the modern world to more than 5 to 10 years at most. This occupation has been going on for 53 years, and it shows no sign of ending. The international humanitarian law says that there's absolutely no annexation that's allowed during this, and that the occupying power must govern in the best interests of the population under occupation, the Palestinians in this case, and they must govern in good faith and follow international law. So what are Israel's arguments with respect to why it refuses to recognize the applicability of the Fourth Geneva Convention? It says that at the time of the 1967 war, when it captured Gaza from Egyptian control and East Jerusalem and the West Bank from Jordanian control, neither Egypt or Jordan properly held sovereignty over those Palestinian territories. Therefore, according to the Israeli argument, no prior sovereignty means yesterday means there's no occupation today, and that Israel has as good a title, if not a better title, it says, than any other country to be able to control and indeed annex these lands. So those arguments are repeatedly made by Israel. The only country in the world which has accepted that at the present time is the Trump administration of the United States. The international consensus has been overwhelming with the fact that the Palestinian territories are not disputed, as Israel says, but are actually occupied, and therefore the Fourth Geneva Convention applies. The United Nations Security Council, which is the body with the highest international standing in the world, the highest political deliberative body that we have, has said on at least 22 occasions since 1967 that the Fourth Geneva Convention applies in full to the Palestinian territory. On many occasions, the Security Council has strongly deplored, those are quotes, Israel's non-compliance, and demanded that it immediately and scrupulously wind up applying the convention. And this has been the stance of the Security Council, has been agreed to by the International Court of Justice, which is the highest ranking, I guess, judicial body that we have in the world, certainly the highest ranking one in the UN system. It said it in 2004 in an advisory opinion that it found that the Fourth Geneva Convention is applicable to the Palestinian territories occupied by Israel. So I guess my point is that the Israeli argument has very few supporters internationally, and yet Israel can continue to maintain that its rule over the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza is not occupation, and apply its own particular laws, its military laws to the Palestinians, its civil laws to the Israeli settlers living in the West Bank. So the second point I want to bring to your attention in the little time that I have has to do with annexation. Annexation, as you probably are aware of, is absolutely prohibited, absolutely restricted by international law. And that comes from Article 2 of the 1945 Charter of the United Nations. This was a foundation point 75 years ago when the United Nations was created, that it recognized that allowing countries to annex territory conquered in wars would only wind up giving an incentive to countries to not regard their own borders, not respect the borders of other countries, and to engage in aggressive, destructive wars, which brings untold suffering to humans. In order to outlaw that, in order to ensure that we try to resolve all of our differences in a peaceful fashion, annexation was absolutely forbidden since 1945. And the principal UN resolution that you see, United Nations Security Council Resolution 242, passed in November 1967, 53 years ago, emphasized the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. And that the United Nations has said that on a number of occasions since then. I believe since there's been, since at least 11 occasions since 1967, the UN the Security Council has stated this, and annexation is now deemed to be a crime of aggression under amendments to the 1998 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. Israel's position with respect to this is that it's entitled to annex, in this case, East Jerusalem, which it annexed in 2 stages in 1967 and 1980. It did that. The world condemned the annexation, both in 1967 and 1980. Israel has created 12 settlements in Palestinian East Jerusalem with 215 Jewish settlers, 215,000 Jewish settlers, and it's constructed a wall that separates Palestinian East Jerusalem from the Palestinian West Bank. And the Trump plan, the Peace to Prosperity plan that was issued in January of 2020 and now appears for the moment to be a dead letter, would have allowed Israel to annex another 30 to 35% of the West Bank. The response of the United Nations is, as I said, the Security Council has passed at least 11 resolutions criticizing Israeli annexation of East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. In 1980, it declared Israel's annexation of East Jerusalem to be null and void and a flagrant violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and has since, on a number of occasions, strongly deplored Israel's contravention of the anti-annexation resolutions and criticized, and I quote, the failure of Israel to show any regards for the resolutions of the General Assembly and the Security Council. So let me just show you these settlements in East Jerusalem. West Jerusalem would be the area in white where you see Israel. The area conquered by Israel and annexed to the city in 1980 is the area on the right side in white, and you can see the 12 Israeli settlements that wind up being built in the middle of Palestinian East Jerusalem. The area in yellow is West Bank controlled territory by the Palestinians. So this has, East Jerusalem has roughly 315,000 Palestinian Arabs and about 215 to 220,000 Israeli settlers living in these settlements in the territory annexed by Israel. Now, going on to the third point I want to make has to do with the Israeli settlements. This map put out by the United Nations is a map of the West Bank. The area in, I guess, light blue or purple in the middle of the map is area C of the West Bank, which is the area under, in total, Israeli security and civil control. The area in white or yellow is the area that's ruled by the Palestinian Authority is roughly 40% of the West Bank. But I should say that Israel has complete military freedom to enter into the 40% of the territory that is administered by the Palestinian Authority. And there's 250 settlements altogether. About 12 of them are in East Jerusalem, and the rest are scattered all throughout the West Bank. You can see the Jordan Valley is the area on your right-hand side of the map, which is almost entirely in blue going up and down. And most of the Israeli settlements are close to the where you see that red line that follows the trace of the separation wall, but some are located deep inside the West Bank. So if I was to tell you what the 40% of the West Bank that's administered by the Palestinian Authority looks like, the map would kind of look like this. This is the so-called Palestinian archipelago. So this is 167 separate islands of territory in the West Bank that the Palestinian Authority administers. And you can see that to go any distance at all from one of the green areas to another green area, you're passing through so-called Area C, where the Palestinians have to go through Israeli roadblocks or to travel. And you can imagine, first what impact that has both on the freedom of movement, but also on the freedom to trade. You can't have a dynamic, growing economy unless you have the freedom to be able to move in a territory and trade your goods one with another. So what we have is a highly dependent, highly fragmented Palestinian economy that's hardly able to move its goods outside to trade with the international community, let alone being able to trade from, say, Bethlehem in the south to Ramallah in the north to Nablus or Jenin in the far north, just because of the huge amounts of time and effort taken to be able to transport goods from north to south in the areas of the West Bank controlled and administered by the Palestinian Authority. So what does international law say with respect to the Israeli settlements? It says that since 1949, when the Fourth Geneva Convention came into being, it says that the occupying power is not allowed to move any of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. And that is meant to try to dampen any incentive for an occupying power to want to move your civilian population into your occupied territory in order to be able to establish a future sovereignty claim. Again, it's because the world saw that that powers that are acquisitive, that want to be able to expand their borders, are only going to be causing countless and needless wars by trying to alter the shape of their homeland. So the Fourth Geneva Convention was, among other things, was meant to put a stop to that kind of acquisitive power, to allow occupying powers to annex. And we see a number of different statements here by the United Nations and by international treaties, which that the Israeli settlements have no legal validity. They're a flagrant violation under international law. You can see where the Security Council said that almost 4 years ago. And under the last point I've got there from the Rome Statute, it actually says that civilian occupations created by an occupying power are a war crime, which is the most serious of offenses under international law. So what are some of the key facts with respect to the Israeli settlements? As I say, there were roughly 250 Jewish-only settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory, the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The population of the West Bank is more than 450,000, another 215 to 220,000 settlers in East Jerusalem, as well as 20,000 settlers in the Syrian Golan Heights. So we're coming close to, if we haven't already exceeded, 700,000 Israeli settlers, which is roughly 10% of the Jewish population of Israel are in the occupied territories. And I see at the bottom there where I say that Israel has already approved more than 12,000 settlement housing units in 2020, which is a record over the last decade for the number of settlement units being approved, which tells you that Israel plans to be there forever. More facts with respect to the Israeli settlements. The High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations has stated on a number of occasions the kinds of human rights impact that the Israeli settlements have. And here's a list of some of the most grievous human rights violations: land confiscation, Israeli settler violence, as I've said before, discriminatory planning laws, discriminatory law enforcement, the demolition of Palestinian homes, the appropriation of natural resources, and shrinking territorial space left for the Palestinians. The last point I want to make, because I want to leave time for you to be able to ask questions if you do have any, has to do with the issue of the importance of accountability in international relations. Accountability is that promise that states make to one another that they will enforce international law. That in fact, when you sign your name representing your country to an international agreement with one other country or with 190 other countries, you're making a promise that you take your responsibilities listed out under that treaty or convention seriously, and you will wind up applying that, and you will enforce it against countries that do not wind up obeying that. And here you'll see my own statement that I made in 2020, where I say the international supervision of the 53-year-old Israeli occupation of Palestine illustrates that between international law and international accountability, there is an enormous gap between promise and performance. International law should not be an umbrella that folds up when it starts to rain. And there is plenty of law with respect to accountability in international law. What these key provisions state is that every country has an obligation to ensure that every other country is obeying its obligations, its responsibilities, its duties under international law. And you see the third of the three items that I list there, Article 25 of the Charter of the United Nations, which says that the members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the Charter, which means that all of the resolutions of the Security Council that I've listed, that apply to Israel and that Israel has refused to obey and to put into action, is actually a violation of Israel's solemn oath as a member of the United Nations that will obey what it's told to do by the Security Council. So what is the end game with respect to this? Kofi Annan, who was the UN Secretary General between 1996 and 2006, said that the failure to achieve an Arab-Israeli peace is a core source of frustration and instability in the region. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not simply one unresolved problem among many. No other issue carries such a powerful symbolic or emotional charge affecting people far from the zone of conflict. And this is from Daniel Levy, who was a former Israeli peace process negotiator in 2000, who now is a very prominent spokesperson on Israeli-Palestinian issues. He said here that human rights and international legality should be our guiding star and should no longer be subordinated to maintaining a peace process that has so palpably failed to wind up delivering. And he talks about the importance of protecting human rights defenders in both Israel and Palestine, of backing serious investigations into grave human rights violations, including the ongoing work of the International Criminal Court. So with that, let me say thank you for this, and I'm happy to try to take any of your questions in the time that we wind up having. So I'll turn it back to you to moderate the questions.
Okay, thanks a lot, Michael. I think it was really interesting, and we have some people connected in Facebook as well who were listening to you. And also I think the student that can be present now will be really interested in looking at the conference in another moment. I don't know if someone has some questions for now. I actually have a couple. Maybe I will start and then we'll see if one will follow. Regarding what you were saying about accountability, I was thinking, what do you think Israel really accountable for all its crimes? Because I mean, we know more or less the know. Now we know better with your explication, but really doesn't seem that it's going to happen really soon. What do you think?
That's a very good question. It's something that I wake up every day asking myself with respect to what to do, because international law, as I've just pointed out, is so clear with respect to what the obligations of Israel are to do, which is to respect Palestinian self-determination, which is the territory that it conquered in 1967, to a new Palestinian state, and to develop peaceful and productive relations between Israel and Palestine. What will it take to hold Israel accountable? I think that the power imbalance, militarily, politically, diplomatically, demographically, are so much in Israel's favor with respect to this that you will never have a durable and just resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict negotiated between the parties themselves. It will only come about through the concerted and unified action of the international community. And I guess, you know, I could talk for a long time on this, but let me cut to the chase. I think Europe has a particular responsibility with regards to this. Europe is Israel's largest trading partner. It about a third of Israel's trade with the international community goes to the European Union, and there are strong and deep economic, social, cultural, and political ties between Europe and the European Union on the one hand, and Israel on the other. If Europe acted with determination to say, Israel, you have to obey international, we will actually put out consequences if you don't do that, then I think you may well see a moving of the needle in Israel. As long as Israel is a rational actor, and as long as Israel believes that it can continue to deepen its hold over the occupied territories, it can continue to build its claim for formal annexation without consequences, without a cost coming from the international community, it will continue to do so. What rational actor acting on the incentive to get more territory and with no deterrence being put to it is going to act otherwise with respect to that? So if Europe was to say, in our treaties that we have with you, Israel, we talk about having shared values. Surely human rights and the obedience of international law are part of what we would consider to be shared values between any two states with respect to this. If Europe actually acted on the criticism that it delivers to Israel when Israel builds more settlement housing units, when it winds up demolishing more European Union funded schools and houses and structures built for Palestinians, if Europe would act upon all of these violations, I think you'd see a change. What I fear is going to happen is that I was hoping Europe would take a more independent stance under the Trump administration, because it was so clear that the policies of the Trump administration towards Israel and Palestine were so one-sided and lopsided. But Europe didn't do what I was hoping it would do. I fear now that under the new incoming American administration, that it will continue to look to the U.S. to take a lead. And my early judgment of the incoming American administration is that putting a true peace process into place, putting a peace process that respects international law, is not high on the agenda of the American administration. So the other thing I will say very briefly in answer to your question is public opinion is important. The work of human rights organizations and civil society organizations in Europe is important to move public opinion, and therefore to move political opinion to taking more consequential steps. We see this in some countries. I know there's a strong civil society movement in in Spain. I see this in Ireland. I see this in Belgium, in Norway, in Sweden. So these are the countries that I think have to lead the Europe and the European Union with respect to trying to change its actual policies on the ground. It's not enough to criticize anymore.
Yeah, I have a comment here from Jose Ramon saying that the EU is divided on this issue. I don't know what you were referring to.
Yes, thanks so much. It was very interesting presentation, Michael. When you were saying in response to Laura that the position that that Europe would be taking would be crucial, I entirely agree. But it seems to me that internally the EU member states don't have a common stance on the issue. You can see divisions across the member states, and you see that not only in the Israel-Palestine issue, you can see it also in the Western Sahara case. So there is it's a complexity inside the EU that probably is blocking some of the common positions that could have been adopted. So maybe it can save its face by supporting financially the Palestinian Authority in its very limited autonomy, and that's about it. There's not much else that is going to probably, unless there was that desirable unanimity within the EU, very much less that it can do actually.
I hear you on that, and I realize that you have 27 member states, and there's a wide spectrum across the European Union with respect to how critical or how critical these countries are with respect to Israel's actions in the Palestinian territory. The countries I mentioned to you a few minutes ago are among the most liberal of countries.
Yes.
I know that there are countries in Eastern Europe
yes.
that are very close to the current Israeli government, and in fact share many of, I guess, a stance towards a more illiberal democracy in these situations, which is troubling. But there are a lot of decisions which Europe can take with respect to, European Union can take with respect to Israel and Palestine that don't require unanimity. And this is what I'm urging the European Union to seriously contemplate, that it should be able to take decisions based on a majority vote among those procedural issues that it's allowed to do so, and begin to put cost and consequences on Israel for the actions that it's taking. It's astounding to me that a country can have built up a 53-year-old occupation that shows no signs of ending, that shows every sign of becoming a permanent. A new word that I've been told recently is occu-annexation, that it can continue on that path with virtually no consequences coming from what I think is a fairly liberal, modern federation of states that have recognized the folly of war and the folly of ignoring international law. If anything that unites the European Union today, it's the sense of the rule of law, and that we have to wind up finding peaceable means of settling all of our disputes. And I noticed in the last few days, there's now a controversy in Europe over Poland and Hungary as to whether or not they're in compliance with the rule of law. And there is talk by some major European Union powers as to how to bring Poland and Hungary and other states that may be inclined to follow their path within the rule of law. Surely, if you're raising those questions with respect to your own members, surely you can raise that with respect to an external state that you have strong diplomatic and economic and cultural ties with as well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. But the problem is, even within those internal problems, Hungary, Poland, the EU doesn't seem to be able to do very much to bring them in line. So if it cannot, to turn the argument round, if it cannot even do it with its own member states, how will it do it outside? It's a tricky diplomatic issue as well. And also, to be fair, Israel has been attacked in wars. It didn't historically. It wasn't initiating those wars. That's probably an argument that it likes to use constantly, that it's a sort of defense strategy, and this is necessary for the survival of the state. And this is what some countries, member states in Europe, are buying as an argument. That's a problem. It has to be turned around, and I think you rightly point out that it has to be uncovered, and the serious violations of not only human rights but international law and humanitarian law and the Geneva Convention should be an argument enough to put more pressure on the state of Israel.
I agree with you. And what I want to point out, based on your remarks, is that Europe has two very important historical responsibilities that it must keep in mind. First, obviously, is the special debt that it has towards what has happened to the European Jews over the last century. It has, because of the policies of several countries and the extermination of European Jewry during the Second World War, Europe has a special historical debt to ensure that Jews of the world and Jews of Europe and the Jews elsewhere are kept safe and protected. And that's what makes understanding this conflict, I think, so always so complex and so complicated. But along with that, Europe has a special responsibility with respect to the Palestinians as well, because it was, I suppose, European ideas that led to the first of all the attempt to partition Palestine, and then subsequently to the expulsion of about 2/3 of the Palestinian population in 1947, 1949. So Europe, I understand, has two responsibilities here, and they don't have to be contradictory. If you look at these two responsibilities through the lens of international law and of human rights, then that will surely guide you to an end result that's going to be just for everybody. And whether the end result is a two-state solution with a genuine Palestinian state living beside a genuine Israeli state, or it's a one-state solution with equal votes and equal power for all, or some other imaginative solution, it has to be obedient to human rights and the issue of equality.
Yes, and respect for minorities. I think maybe we should change the language, and instead of talking about two-state solution, we should talk about two sustainable. Because even if you created two states with the one state being the Palestinian archipelago, it wouldn't be sustainable at all. So.
I couldn't agree with you more with respect to that. I think it has to be two genuine states if it's going to be a two-state solution. What I worry about is whether or not we've passed the last exit on the road to two-state solution, on the road towards annexation. I worry that the continued repetition of the term two-state solution that most diplomats use today is a fig leaf action on this particular issue. And that's why I insist upon having the lens of human rights by which we view all developments and all policies towards Israel and Palestine.
Yeah, actually.
There's also, Laura, if I may, one last question or comment.
Yeah.
This is the problem created by Brexit, because in a sense, on the European Union, the UK being the former occupying metropolis in Palestine, this removes, somehow the pressure and responsibility of the former occupying responsible power, and this leaves the European Union a little bit in an odd situation where the UK probably should have been very much in charge of seeking solutions after it simply left Israel, and the EU doesn't probably have all the know-how or the historical material to be able to put pressure in Israel. So that's another further problem for the EU now.
Well, I'm seeing we're coming to the bottom of the hour, which tells me I think we're either close to being done, if not done. You tell me how much more time we have, Laura.
I think we can have like 10 more minutes because we started a little bit later, if it's okay for you. Yeah.
That's fine for me.
Okay, great. Actually, I wanted to make a comment when you were talking like that if we can arrive to a solution or not. It's like when you were before talking about settlements as well. It's like this is like Israeli strategy to make facts on the ground that you can change. So following the law, how is it reversible like all the settlements strategy or not?
Very good question, and you're asking me to look into the future with respect to this. Any solution, be it a genuine two-state solution or a one-state solution of equality for all, seem to me, at least I've not heard any other solution that would fit within the prism of international human rights. Both of them would be complicated to try to get to. Neither of them is there an easy path to get to. The two-state solution is obviously complicated by the fact that you have 250 Israeli settlements with somewhere between 650,000 and now 700,000 Israeli settlers there. You saw the kind of convulsion in 2005 that Israel went through when it removed 8,000 settlers from the Gaza Strip. To try to remove some or all of the 700,000 Israeli settlers is going to would be a hugely complicated situation. Likewise, if you wind up creating a one-state solution that was based upon equality for all, and right now, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, there is probably a parity, an equality of populations between 6.5 million Palestinian Arabs and roughly 6.5 million Israeli Jews. In order to be able to find a solution that enhances the rights of Palestinians and takes away some of the legal privileges that Israeli Jews would wind up having if you're going to have a functioning modern new state based on equality, there's also a complicated path to get there. I don't pretend to have the answers on how to do that, other than to say it has to be informed by human rights. But this will not be a task that will be accomplished tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. But unless we start thinking about this, what we want as our end goal, we're not going to get there. My father always used to say to me, if you don't know where you're going, you can be sure you're not going to get there. And he also used to say to me as well, you know, the best time to plant an oak tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now. Yes, we've gone for a long periods, long decades, without applying international law with respect to this, where we've come to agreements or we've launched peace processes outside of the framework of the very clear dictates of international law. But to my view, we still can use international law. We have to use international law. Any agreement or any peace process that's predicated simply on might as opposed to international law is doomed to failure in the Middle East, because Israel will resist it with its extraordinary power advantage over the Palestinians. International law is meant to try to reduce the power imbalances between any two parties and to ensure that any solution or any resolution or any remedy is going to be based on accepted principles that are widely endorsed by, in this case, the international community. So that's I think the tools we have to get there. What we now have to do is use those tools to do the hard work of thinking, what is the path to wind up getting there? To be able to convince everybody that the Palestinians aren't going to go anywhere and Israeli Jews aren't going to go anywhere, and that their only assured future together, their only prosperous future assured together, is going to be together, is if they live in some basis either with two equal states or with equal rights in one state.
Yeah. I don't know if anyone has some question, or maybe like to change the theme for a second. I would like to make like a last question, if it's okay for everyone. Since you talk about the importance of social movement and social support or support from civil society for Palestine, we know right now like the biggest campaign to support Palestine is the BDS campaign. And here in Spain, but I think like worldwide, it has been attacked. Sometimes accused to be anti-Semitic, as we know it's a normal, common strategy for Israel. And here in Spain, it has gone to court. It has arrived to court as well. If it is legal or not to boycott some product from Israel. So do you know, like, there is something that international law can do about it to protect the boycott, the right to boycott, or to support the?
Sure. Okay, let me say first, as a special rapporteur, I don't take a position with respect to BDS because it involves issues that are, some of which are outside my mandate. But on the other hand, I defend BDS or any movement that is non-violent and that is not discriminatory. And I do call for boycotts. In my most recent report as UN Special Rapporteur, I call for a prohibition of the entry of settlement goods and services into the international marketplace. By allowing settlement goods to come into the international marketplace, that only enables more oxygen to be given to the settlement economy. And as long as the settlement economy is maintained, the occupation will continue. The settlements are the engine of the occupation. And the second thing I want to say is that boycotts generally are an accepted form of free expression and free speech anywhere in the world where the rule of law is respected. Boycotts have a long and honorable tradition in many countries as a form of seeking justice and reparation for vulnerable or marginalized or oppressed groups. And I see nothing wrong with the right of people being able to say, I want to boycott this or I want to boycott that, as long as I said it is non-discriminatory and it is non-violent, and therefore that right should wind up existing. And I think, yes, there are protections in international law, particularly in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, with respect to freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and freedom of association. And those are at the heart of supporting any form of a boycott movement. But more importantly, almost any constitution of a country that believes in the genuine rule of law will have freedom of expression and freedom of association protected in their constitution. Certainly, it's true in the constitution in my country. It's true in the United States. Some of the leading civil rights decisions in the United States were based on the right to boycott in furtherance of the civil rights movement for African Americans to achieve equality in the United States. And I see where there have been rulings in the European courts as well with respect to the right to boycott. This has to be defended. Regardless of what your views are on BDS, the right to be able to boycott on the principles that I've mentioned has to be defended.
Yeah, of course. I don't know if there are any more comments on this, or I think, like, since it's 5:30, I think we can close the conference. And it was really, really interesting to have you, Michael. Thanks a lot. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks a lot to the EUGUNE and to the UPV and the professor that make it helps us doing this.
It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. You know, I thank you so much for the opportunity to be able to speak to your audience. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I hope our paths will wind up crossing again, either virtually or in person with respect to this. All the best, and good luck with your work.
Likewise.
Thank you, Michael. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.